Good evening, everybody, and welcome. So tonight at the Royal Society we have a joint event organized in partnership with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and I think the first such joint event of its kind. My name is Uta Frith. I'm a professor of cognitive development at UCL with a strong interest in history. And this evening I have the pleasure of introducing our leading characters, Adriano Shaplin and Simon Schaffer. You may already know that this event is being webcast live from the Royal Society website, and it is recorded so you can see it again later if you wish. And all this is thanks to Michael Shepherd up there and Liam Helm, who are doing this for us. And by the way, now is a good idea to switch off your mobiles. We have two remarkable people who will be in conversation first with each other and then with the rest of us. Simon Schaffer is a professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. He has presented a series for the BBC called Light Fantastic, which some of you might know, and he is the author of much admired books on the history of science. Of course, the most relevant for today is this, his book with Simon Schaffer, Leviathan and the Air Pump, and with the subtitle Hobbes, Boyle and the Experimental Life. A few more details about Simon Schaffer from his website. He studied at Cambridge and at Harvard, and he has been a fellow of Darwin College at Cambridge since 1985. And we can also find on his website that he is a noted supporter of Tottenham Hotspurs. Adriano Shaplin is a highly acclaimed playwright, and he has been the co-founder and artistic director of the Riot Group in New York. He's had great success with a number of original productions, including Victory at the Dirt Palace and Pugilist Specialist. In the last couple of years, Adriano was the first Warwick/RCS international playwright in residence. And at the Royal Shakespeare Company, he worked closely in rehearsals with the artistic director, Michael Boyd, and developed ideas for a play specifically for the ensemble of actors at the RSC. And this work culminated in that tragedy of Thomas Hobbes, giving its full title, Including the Birth of Empirical Science in Robert Boyle and the Restoration of Charles II. And this play, as you all know, is being shown now at Wilton's Music Hall. So if I'm allowed a few personal remarks, after seeing the play last week, it really was as if I was seeing in vivid action the very people that Simon Schaffer has written about, Hobbes and Boyle and Hooke, and all the other experimentalists. It was as if I was listening to the language spoken in 17th century London. Quite remarkable. So I felt transported as a witness of the events that led to the beginning of the Royal Society, and of course how apposite that we should have this conversation here tonight. Now, thanks to Felicity Henderson and Keith Moore, who look after the library and the archives and records of the Royal Society, we actually have on show, next to Adriano, an air pump. It's not the original one that was used by Boyle in his famous demonstrations, and as you know, put to very great effect in the play. But it is one that dates from 1705. And thanks to Felicity and Keith, we also have a portrait here of Thomas Hobbes. A portrait of Robert Boyle can be seen in the reception area, as of course there is a portrait of Charles II. It will be fascinating to discover why our conversationalists have been so enthralled by Thomas Hobbes, Robert Boyle, and Robert Hooke, and indeed why the experimentalists with their air pump are so important to us even today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to present Simon Schaffer and Adriano Shaplin in conversation.
Hi. It's a great honor for both of us. It's certainly an enormous honor for me to be in this conversation and to be allowed to take part. We're guessing, we're depressed by this guess, but we're guessing that not all of you will have seen the play. So while our conversation will certainly refer to it, we'll also try to raise issues that others can join in. And when the play transfers to the West End and goes on its world tour, you'll be able to follow it around. So I wanted to start with really two questions for Adriano. One is, it's obvious when one sees the play. It's in fact obvious when one reflects on where an enterprise like experimental science, experimental philosophy, could ever have come from, that there's a relationship between doing an experiment and putting on a show. They both involve, as many of you know, careful rehearsal. They both look collective in interesting ways. They both require not just props, but also an audience, at least to be credited. They have critics. They involve repetition. They involve, above all, backstage and front stage work. So I think one question to ask Adriano is how the relationship between experiment and theatre affects his work, and this play in particular. And then whether there's something for him, whether there's something for you historically specific about that extraordinary moment in the 1650s and 60s when, at least in this country, organized and institutionalized experiment seemed to get going in a dramatic way.
Okay. Well, I want to thank the Royal Society. They've invited me here a few weeks ago, and they brought out Robert Hooke's diary and his papers and Isaac Newton's death mask. And I've seen the portraits here, so I want to thank them for setting this up. And thank Simon, as his book was one of the main bits of research for writing my play. The origin of the play it's very interesting. I think many people in the room will know what MIT is. If I say MIT, it's the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the major science research university in the States. It has a theater department, not as well known, and quite marginalized, but it does have a theater department, and there's someone that runs that theater department, a woman named Janet Sonnenberg, who approached me about 3 years ago with a very simple question. She'd been looking at this material, and she came and she asked me, as a playwright, do you find it interesting that experimental science, which was a demonstrative science about performance and witnessing, coalesced in England at a time when the theaters were shut? The implication being that there was some sort of vacuum in performance happening in this culture that allowed a new type of performance to gain an audience. And I did find that idea interesting. And I began to investigate these figures, specifically Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke. And we won't summarize the play. I think it's just worth saying that the play begins at the moment roughly around when Robert Boyle hired Robert Hooke to build his air pump. Hired him from Thomas Willis. All these men have their portraits up around here. And it carries on until really the moment when 3 decades later, when Robert Hooke is being marginalized within the Royal Society because of a dispute with Isaac Newton, the man whose portrait is sort of 10 to 1 in this building. He's in every room. And as some of you will know, Robert Hooke does not have a portrait. No one knows what Robert Hooke looks like because his portrait did not survive. And those are the sort of benchmarks of the play. That's where it begins and ends. And in the middle is the Cromwell's government, Charles II's government, and this conflict that erupted between the men who formed the Royal Society and Thomas Hobbes, a man now remembered as a political philosopher who at the time considered himself just a philosopher with a program that covered all of natural and political philosophy. He was vehemently opposed to the new experimental program. He was in a pamphlet war with John Wallis, a geometrist whose portrait appears outside. And he lost. Hobbes lost that battle. The Royal Society was given its charter, and he was banned from publishing on politics or religion for the rest of his life. Even was charged with suspicion of being an atheist, a fate that really fell again on Robert Hooke's head later on in his life. That was the origin of the play. I don't know if I think it's not necessarily for me to make a thesis. As a poet and as a playwright, I try not to make a point or teach anybody anything. That's something different about art, I guess. And I don't think I can't. I think science tells me that I can't be collectively smarter than any audience that appears in a room to see my play. So I won't have anything to teach them. And I don't know if I have a thesis. Do I think that experimental science arrived because there was an absence on the stages? No. But what that leads us to is, I think there's a common assumption that something like an empirical program or an experimental program won because it won. That it became the popular way of knowing because it's the best way of knowing. And everybody in culture sort of determined that, they spontaneously agreed that it was the best way to proceed. And it was Simon's book that told me that this was not true. And that, in fact, there's a more complicated story, and that progress in human civilization is not a form of natural selection or survival of the fittest. That there's complicated, tangled political and social realities and accidents of fate and of personality that lead to certain programs winning the day and other people being lost in history.
Well, one of the reasons to push on the experiment-theatre relationship is because, as many of us, I guess, know very well, there's been recently an enormous amount of work in the theatre around thinking if it's possible to put science on stage.
Yeah.
So one thinks of Frayn's Copenhagen. One thinks of the play, which some of you may have seen on the BBC on Saturday about Eddington and Einstein, about which I will not speak, and a whole range of attempts to communicate more effectively, more quizzically perhaps, what is at stake culturally and intellectually about the sciences. So I think one of the issues that arises there is a pretty practical one, for one thing, which is once one starts to realize that making experiments and showing them are very closely related and not the same, then the theatrical issue about the sciences becomes extremely pressing and interesting, both for people in your line of work and for people in mine. I mean, in at least this way, that as we know very well, the more intimately you see how a show's prepared, the less credible the claims the show makes are. So that if we could see all the rehearsals, and if we could see the failed runs, and if they do get published, then there's a sense in which not the veracity, that's a different issue, but the credibility of the claim is then to a certain extent in trouble, right?
This is what's so, I mean, we might get ahead of ourselves here, but something that's so tangled about this confrontation, this collision between Hobbes and the Royal Society gentlemen.
He didn't believe in ghosts, but...
is that what Hobbes used against Robert Boyle was that, the air pump I mean, Robert Boyle was attempting to build what we would now know as a vacuum seal, a globe in which you could evacuate all air. And it was beyond, despite his vast wealth, being one of the richest men in England because of his family's Irish land holdings, he wasn't able to get a vacuum seal. In fact, there was always leaks. But what was beautiful and modern about Boyle's notion was that you should publish your mistakes. So in among his notes about air pump experiments, he always acknowledged that it leaked, and that they called it the spring in air rather than a vacuum or whatever we would call it now, pressure, air pressure. And Hobbes used this against him. Hobbes, being the absolutist, said, how can you make any of these claims when you yourself admit that your pump leaks? Hobbes was used to constructing knowledge in a way that could never be denied.
That didn't leak.
That didn't leak, that cut out all the mess. And Boyle was attempting something very different, very radical. And what I've come to see as a kind of democracy of seeing. To wind back a bit, it's important also to say, and this is the great conundrum of the play and of this period, is that Robert Boyle saw the air pump as a new model for a miracle. He saw the air pump as a way of increasing faith in God. And the great sort of contradiction is, when you said about writing a play about progress or about the Enlightenment, I immediately have an idea in my head of what that's supposed to look like.
Right.
That it's supposed to look like one time long, long ago when men wore breeches, there were modern thinking individuals who had ideas that can be traced right up to our present, and that they had to do battle with crusty old dogmatics who believed in God and wouldn't let the march of progress proceed. What I've come to call Enlightenment propaganda, and something that gels very well with a debate you get in this country, the notion of faith versus reason. When you look at this moment, the actual moment when empirical science coalesced, the moment when science and religion began to become unbraided, what you have is a group of pious Anglican Christians, all God-fearing and God-loving, who really, had a concept of intelligent cause, very similar to intelligent design today.
Absolutely.
And that their enemy, Thomas Hobbes, was a materialist and, in their eyes, an atheist. And that's why he was illegitimate as a scientist.
Sure.
He was illegitimate as a scientist because he did not believe in incorporeal spirits. And when he looked at these Anglican bishops, the Bishop John Wallace, the Bishop John Wilkins, the Honorable Robert Boyle, a figure of piety, he saw a new breed of priests trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the people with incantation, transmutation, and alchemy.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have things to say about that in discussion when the two of us shut up.
Okay.
Let me just point out that Wallace wasn't a bishop, he was a Presbyterian. That doesn't matter for these purposes, perhaps. After all, Richard III wasn't a crookback, but that doesn't mean Shakespeare's play was rubbish.
Yeah. I followed Shakespeare's, roughly as accurate as Shakespeare's histories are.
Yes, I think
mine are.
That's
with the same level of anachronism.
Okay, I shall use those standards then. But I take the point. I mean, there is an interesting, what should we say, chiasmus, an exchange of properties here, right? That experimenters in this period, certainly those gathered at Gresham College at the early Royal Society, are pious, almost all of them, and in many cases, and Boyle is the spectacular example, one has to be a Christian virtuoso. One can't be a Christian, Boyle argues, without discharging the duty of inquiring into nature. Right. So it isn't simply voluntary, it's essential. One must investigate, one must inquire, because this is God's other book. And not to read this book is like not reading Scripture. Mm-hmm. That's very clear. Similarly, for Hobbes, machines like the one behind you are machines designed to con you into thinking that there can be stuff that isn't stuff, that there can be matter that isn't matter, that there can be an agent that is immaterial. And Hobbes says the cause of rebellion is the fear of things invisible. So that Hobbes, after all, had lived through, in a way that, thank goodness one might say, our generations have not lived through, the catastrophe of a civil war. So that in his history of the Civil War, Behemoth, masterpiece, everyone should read this book, he has his interlocutors, it's a dialogue, he has his voice say that it would have been better to kill the 1,000 priests that there were in England in 1640, and he means the Presbyterians, like John Wallis, because then 100,000 people would not have died. That's where Hobbes is coming from. So that the fear of war and how close we always are to that is what drives, I think, a lot of the philosophical argument. The idea, for example, that you could build an order out of leaving everyone to, as we say now, make up their own mind, that's too risky. That's far too risky, and Hobbes has good evidence that what happens if you let that risk run.
Right.
And then the final point, which I think brings us back to the question of the theatre again, is for Hobbes, it's patently obvious that you can't trust what you see. He lives in a world which is cascading with deceit and illusion and trickery and prestidigitation. He lives, and we don't, right? He lives in a world of spin. And we don't, thank goodness. But one of the things that Adriano's play, I think, shows wonderfully well is this is not just the moment of the return of theatre, and it's not just the moment of the institutionalization of experiment. It's also a moment when, very, very early, one sees the spin doctors. One sees the manipulators of opinion, the pamphlet warriors, the people who use ink instead of blood to achieve their ends. And they play an absolutely crucial role in your play, as they should. So one question to get at there is, isn't there a relation between the worry about pious experimenters and the worry about spin? Because you're worried, Hobbesians would be worried, at how easy it is to manipulate what people think they see.
I considered it my job as an artist to not buy into the spin or the propaganda and to investigate what was rotten about this society forming and what kind of rotten, dirty business is done to get your ideas through.
I should explain for those of you who haven't seen the play that one of the characters who starts out as a transvestite actor and then ends up being Boyle's servant before he's displaced by Hook has the name Rotten.
When you talk about the theater, the play does resolve in Thomas Shadwell's sort of famous piss take, for lack of a better word, of the new science and of the Royal Society. And reading this play, which was done in England only about 15 years after the Society received its charter, one does have a sense of a rival literary technology and a rival performance technology trying to reclaim back what the scientists, the audience that the scientists have stolen. An attempt to make the scientists, we were all familiar with this, seem ridiculous, concerned with things like the weight of air. It's very unfortunate that Boyle investigated air. As you say, it sort of is the perfect target for those that believe that science is a form of invisible incantation.
But there's an interesting issue there which we've not talked about much, which is, I mean, it seems to be one of the most genial aspects of what Boyle and Hook and Willis understand, is that if you want to understand something in the world, look at what happens when it's not there. So why does Boyle need an air pump? He needs an air pump because he's fascinated by that thing in the air that keeps us alive. He's a disciple of the great William Harvey. He knows that the blood circulates through the body, and in particular between the heart and the lungs. He knows that something enters the blood from the lungs. He and Willis and other Oxford natural philosophers understand extremely well that, or they think they understand extremely well, that there must be some principle, some spirit in the air that enters the lungs. If it did not do so, then we would be in trouble. But the ingenuity was to see that if you wanted to understand what there is in the air that's vital, it's a great idea to get rid of the air. And that's what machines like that allow you to do. So
which is monstrous, really.
It's
from
an
Thomas
issue of,
Hobbes' perspective, it's a monstrosity to investigate the world this way.
And I wonder, I mean, so another question for us to think about, for you to think about. One of the successes of the play, I think, was that it conveyed how implausible is that thought. That thought that if you're fascinated by an agent, look what happens when it's not there. That seems very strange, perhaps. Instead of looking more closely at it, let's begin by making a space without it and see what happens. I slightly regret, from that point of view, the absence in the play of an experiment. I mean, not that I have any idea how one would have done this. A representation of an experiment which involved putting animals inside the air pump.
Oh, well, we didn't want to copy that famous painting. We thought that's the painting everyone knows. And, oh, putting an animal in. Well, in England, you can't kill animals on stage. You know, it's like they use the horses so that people won't riot because there's such animal lovers here. No, we did the one with coal.
Yes,
we couldn't kill any birds on stage. You know, we were talking before about this. Maybe this is, you know, connected. What we're talking is that Thomas Hobbes, you know, it seemed as if he lived at a time when the human mind, you know, he argued for absolute sovereignty. He believed there should be one strong ruler in charge of everything, and that everyone should just give assent. That's the only way society will work. This idea of figuring things out for yourself or having your own opinion was abhorrent to him. I mean, he was an apologist for absolute sovereignty, absolute monarchy, and not even monarchy, as long as any ruler of any stripe, as long as they were absolute and everyone could follow them. And he felt the same way about philosophy. He really felt you can't have competing philosophies. You need to have one figure. And I think he wanted himself to be, he was auditioning his whole life for the role of the single sovereign philosopher of the land. My impression from reading your book and from doing the research was that he saw the single human mind as the highest common denominator, that there was nothing worth knowing in the world that a single human mind could not know through rationation, and that because no one else can be trusted, because confederacies, factions, and government-sanctioned agencies are conspiracies that can't be trusted, that the only pure form of knowledge that could be trusted is that which a single human being could arrive at on their own, in a vacuum, in a way. That as we know, Thomas Hobbes was against the notion of experiments. He was, you know, took dictation for, as it says in the play, he took dictation for Francis Bacon when he was 21 and blonde, and believed that, you know, you don't do experiments, you write them out, and that's enough. And what was extraordinary about Boyle was, and I think I credit it with the beginning of the motto of this place. The motto, you know, which I'm going to translate as "Take no man's word," is that we need to topple the singularity principle of knowledge. We need to topple the philosopher who's the single philosopher that's right about everything. We need to create this democracy of seeing. And you know, it was what's extraordinary about Boyle's piety and his religiosity, and what science received as a gift from Robert Boyle's religion was humility. Was a sense, and Boyle often wrote, "I'll be wrong. You know, in my pursuit of facts, you know, the great thing about facts is once they're overturned, you discover it never was a fact. It disappears. But knowledge hangs around. You know, that knowledge is something that just sticks to the walls of civilization and can't be torn off. But the fact is very simple. It's either verifiable in our lifetimes or it's overturned and it disappears. And this idea of take no man's word, of a collective witness, that the only thing that we could really depend on was one in which multiple people signed off on it.
But there's an interesting paradox, and again, I think your play.
Are you going to quote Thomas Hobbes' great critique of the Royal Society?
Well, yeah, exactly. I think your play explores this very well, which is that, okay, so you want to say that the experimenters at the Royal Society, Boyle in particular, represent something like what you call a democracy of vision. But we might understand a democracy of vision to mean I'm only going to accept what I see for myself. But that's exactly not the experimental program. That's exactly not what's at stake.
Right.
And Hobbes sees that. It seems to me that Hobbes understood that paradox, that there's some kind of tension in play between the claim that you should only accept what you see for yourself, and if it's true, it should be witnessable. Mm-hmm. Isn't there an odd principle in play there? That if it's a fact, then someone else ought to be able to make it so, and they ought to be able to see it too, right? So there's a collectivism in play in this institution whose slogan is nullius in verba, or no one's word. Right? Just as there's an individualism, a libertarianism, one could even argue, in the Hobbesian position, that I, isolated, on my own, can reckon up what I know and see what is so and see what is not. Isn't that, to be the devil's advocate, the more democratic position?
I think it.
Why should I rely on what the crowd says?
It shows reference for the. It shows reverence for one of humanity's most cherished possessions, our most cherished inheritances, which is our ignorance. What's amazing is that we're all born with the same ignorance. Mm-hmm. You know, the knowledge that we accumulate can't be installed at birth like a hard drive. I mean, we all start from not knowing what's at the bottom of the ocean. I mean, when I'm writing this play, I was constantly struck by the sense that these men, these famous scientists, knew less about the world than the average 13-year-old today would know from watching television. They're really functioning kind of a very dark period of time. It's Newton. It's the next generation that we recognize as being the transcendent geniuses. When we look at people like Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke, and certainly Thomas Hobbes, were struck by this sort of what seemed to us the almost ludicrous mistakes and misapprehensions that they were laboring under.
But they think they're the future.
They were living in the future. That's the other challenge of writing the play, is that you can't write a play about the past. I don't think anyone's really interested in the past. You have to write about what's happening now. Of course, they didn't know they were in the past. Their lived reality was not pastness, but rather, I think the London they lived in was like the Jetsons. I mean, it was full of new inventions, new technologies. It was an unstable universe. I would. That's why I guess I eschew the notions of historical verisimilitude and looking instead for a spiritual truth about the conflict.
Right. That's probably a good moment for us to stop talking to each other and let you join in.
Is that right?
And Uta, do you want to help us?
I shall be delighted to now include everyone else in this really fascinating conversation. But I have to say, I was just thinking, please carry on. Please carry on. This is getting so interesting. Now we're talking about the Jetsons. Can you say a little bit more why you think that new gadgets and new things like this air pump and so on were really important for
Can we fire this thing up? Can I just wind this thing now? No, don't touch it, right? Why were well, again, there's a contrast here, is that you have this portrait of Charles II, but he thought the Royal Society were laughable. I mean, everything he wrote in his diary, even though he gave them the charter, was that they were a bunch of fools. And it was common in England, actually, to see these machines and the advances of the Royal Society as being pointless trifles akin to sort of, robot chess machines that, with a midget hiding inside them, that sort of thing. I guess there's just one point I wanted to pick up before we stopped, which was that Hobbes' critique of the Royal Society was what he saw, rather than the thing we all like to see, which is the progress and enlightenment. What he saw was prestige and exclusivity are very important factors in establishing a society like this. And in fact, if I walk into the Royal Society today, this building, and ask to have something empirically proven to me, I don't think you have the resource. I don't think that happens here anymore. There's nowhere in the Royal Society where I can go and have the marvel of empiricism shown to me as a member of the lay witnessing public. What I get is the prestige. What I know is that people painted portraits of these men. And I suppose the final thought I would have on that is that, in fact, the layperson's perspective on modern empirical science is that we accept it through faith. That faith still plays a role in the way non-specialists encounter this scientific world that we live in.
Very, very provocative, very, very provocative indeed. For somebody like me, I should say. I would say, well, the whole point about being able to witness experiments, and the whole fact that science has so proliferated everywhere. I mean, of course, it can't be contained in a theater anymore, in a single building or anywhere like that, is that we have this network where everybody is witnessing everybody else. I mean, when I say everybody, of course, the exclusivity is still a factor, and I'm sure Simon, you would like to say something about that. There is this special.
Yeah, I mean, I think between
feature.
The individualism of experience, the claim that if something is so, I should be able to see it for myself, that great principle, and the other great principle, which is, but if something is so, then it must have been replicated, and then I can take it on faith. There is this enterprise that Hobbes had an enormous problem with, which is trust. And one of Hobbes's greatest arguments is that every time you go out the door and you lock it, you're proving Hobbes is right. Because it means you show that trust is not well distributed in our world. And you believe that we still, in large measure, live in the state of nature, of the war of all against all. And you think that the default position in the world is an entire collapse of trust. And Hobbes's argument is that only a certain kind of social order can be stably constructed and survive, given how fragile legitimate trustworthiness is. One could say to Hobbes, and hardly anybody in the 1660s said this, some people did say this, but not in this country, that the great strength of empirical inquiry, of the experimental philosophy, was not its skepticism, not the fact that it doubted so well, but that, as my colleague Steve Shaplin points out, that it knows how to trust. The sciences work because they have such a good trust economy, not because they have such a good skepticism economy. And when you talk about the prestige of this institution, which is unquestionable and immense, that's an absolutely crucial element of the commonwealth of the sciences. And it seems to me in the space between Hobbes and Boyle, empty or full, is exactly that issue of trust and trustworthiness. And whether that trust finally is to be invested in technique and engineering and machinery. Is it an object like Francis Hawksby's air pump that one should trust? Or is it rather something slightly less easy to get a grip on?
Just one thing I'd like to know before I leave tonight, I suppose, is Boyle's program was about, the aim of this program was to banish dispute from science. And I suppose what I see when I'm writing the history is a sense that vanity competition and dogma are something that all missioners in this scientific faith encounter. And I presume, I would guess, that still goes on today, that people that work in the sciences still encounter vanity, competition, and run up against dogmatic thinking, still today. So these conflicts that are happening at the birth of the society persist.
Absolutely right. And that's why the play is so relevant. But may I add
Yes.
that it's precisely because of this delicate issue of trust that these things like prestige and competition are so important, because it is actually something like, we might call it reputation, that really makes the witnesses reliable and trustworthy. They will be concerned for their reputation in a very big way, and they hold each other accountable. And if somebody is found out to have falsified the results or something, really, that is absolutely terrible. It does happen, of course, from time
Absolutely.
to time.
Hobbes's worry was exactly the opposite. He was worried that people would be taken to be credible witnesses because they had a high reputation.
But Boyle knew, and the Royal Society knew, in enlisting Boyle as a major figure in the group, that we needed a Christian gentleman to push through this new model of empiricism, which may otherwise be interpreted as an affront to Christian theology.
So
it's politic.
Again, a matter of reputation and trust.
Yeah.
In this sense.
Culturally specific, that's
Yes.
culturally specific.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we really must bring you in to the conversation. I'm sorry, I've been taking over too much.
Much as I'd like to ask your opinion on the influence of Bacon on both Boyle and Hobbes, because maybe he is the space in between, I'd like, actually right up my nose, I'd like to read out something that was said by Isaac Newton and ask your comments on that. And this is, Mr. Macon said to Sir Isaac Newton, when courses of experiments were first in vogue, what a pity it was that when people had a demonstration by geometry, they should trust to their senses, which might be deceived. Upon which Sir Isaac said that he had first proved his inventions by geometry and only made use of experiments to make them intelligible and to convince the vulgar.
That's right. That's right.
I only happen to have it in my bag. Your comments?
Well, in my play, Boyle describes the arrival of Isaac Newton as, cosmic mathematical grace beyond my patience or perception strides the world now before I'm even gone. Isaac Newton did represent a sort of rabbinically complicated new twist in the science of the time. And I certainly think he saw Robert Hooke as a very vulgar, he said, a vulgar man who'd never done any advanced maths in his life.
A mere smatterer.
I mean, he just, of course, his conflict with Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke also was stumbling upon a theory of evolution and of fossils at the time that was utterly suppressed because of its religious implications and because of his conflict with Isaac Newton. So there's incredible things that are lost when progress marches forward, and things that are trampled, which, as the poet's job, for whatever reason, seems to be to uncover those things lost.
I have quite a lot to say about that quote.
Please do, Simon.
But
it's important.
we only have 10 minutes. So
Isaac Newton is the villain in my play. I'm
is,
afraid
yeah.
to say. I think I felt the need to do a corrective. And because I naturally sort of side with Robert Hooke, for whatever reason, maybe because he was poor, he wasn't of the right birth order, he wasn't of the right, he didn't look right, he didn't talk right, and he had the wrong ideas.
and he was from the Isle of Wight.
Yeah. Is the reason why he lost out to this Isaac, this favored son. And it was his religious failings, his theological failings, as much as his programmatic, shall we say, what was it? I mean, he was mad, really. I mean, he did everything. He was, Isaac Newton was a specialist. Isaac Newton went into his room alone for 2 years to solve his problems. Robert Hooke went to the coffee houses every night of his life. and took drugs and got high and had his revelations. Robert Hooke got high. Lisa Jardine is very good about showing that his inspiration came from this mad program of dosing himself with every heavy metal and spirit of Salomoniac he could find, eating mercury and gold. But it would lead to marvelous revelation. And his ability to see past dogma that others couldn't see past. I mean, you were talking smack about Isaac Newton before, about his sort of rigid theological perspective.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would say is that quote that you read out is posthumous, right? That's to say, it's one of the many obiter dicta attributed to Newton after Newton was dead. And it bears almost no relationship to what we now know Newton did, and which even John Machin, who was very close to Newton, didn't know Newton had done. And what's to be explained about that quote, I first did it by geometry, I only did experiments to convince others, is not whether, what contrast that raises with Boyle, because that statement is false. We now know. But what's to be explained is why it was a good idea to believe it. And as Adriano's play, I think, amongst many other texts on this material, reminds us, what is about to happen at the end of the period that we've been talking about is yet another switch in authority towards something like demonstration. Back towards something like demonstration, one might say. So that in fact, after all, if you think of an enterprise like Newton's optics begins with a set of philosophical and theological meditations by a 24-year-old Cambridge student about whether there's any difference between matter and spirit. And he's prompted to these reflections when he's in his 20s because of the threat of Thomas Hobbes and René Descartes, but above all of Hobbes, who says there is no such thing as spirit. And what does Newton do? What Newton does is a series of heroic, don't do this at home, experiments on himself in order precisely to inquire whether there are ways of telling the difference between matter and spirit, hence the famous trials with wooden bodkins pushed between the bone and his eyeball to see if changing the shape of the back of your retina will produce phosphenes, after images, colours. And then, in order to make these facts, in order to make these colours facts, Newton has to devise, it isn't a choice, it is exactly as Adriano's play shows us, he has to make a phenomenon that can be witnessed by others. And he calls that phenomenon by a word which up till then meant ghost. And the word is spectrum. Up till then, spectrum meant a ghost. And from Newton onwards, it means the image of the sun that Newton's experiments show you witnessably on a wall.
My line I wrote for Newton was, he has a soliloquy near the end of the play where he says, which is sort of my attempt to capture what I imagine the scientific mind is a bit like, or what scientific investigation is like from his highly abstracted world. He says, I never hate to be alone. I'm content to stare into the sun for minutes, then make my room a cave for days, and watch the crystalline equations zoom and float across my lid's black curtain. It was a very solitary pursuit that he had, and this idea, he did this. I was struck by this image that he stared into the sun for as long as he could to see how it would affect his eyes, and then sit in darkness for days. It was certainly the type of personality I met when I was at MIT.
So that's why they have a theatre department.
Yes, to try and teach them how to express themselves using their face and their hands. Yeah.
I just add that I don't subscribe either to the mythos of Newtonian solitude, but that's a different play.
We should. Right. This is now the rest of this is going to be like boom, 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 right? Yeah. We're going to do funny answers from now on.
Right, exactly.
Peter Collins.
Thank you. In view of the way you portray Charles II in the play, and in view of your earlier lovely discussion about the paradoxes of authority in this context, I'd be fascinated to hear each of you talk a bit about why the early experimenters sought the patronage of the king.
I find this is one of the mysteries that I don't know if I was able to solve. I mean, why did they pursue? The king asked them in the play, you know, aren't you better off as independent men of means? And they say, independence is vain, Lord. It cannot be trusted. When men labor for the state, they work harder and for a greater good. It's the old philosophers that serve themselves for vain glory alone. But that's as close as I got to an answer to your question. I'm not sure why they got it, didn't they? But
no.
they didn't get it. They got the charter, but they never got any money?
It's teaching this audience to suck eggs in a way to remind us of the very grim fact, how apt today of all days, of the great contrast between London and Paris in this respect in the 1660s, then as now. After all, the situation in Restoration London was that you paid to be a member of this society. And the relationship with royal patronage, much discussed by historians, is in that sense fraught and anxious. And although there was attempt after attempt to secure something slightly more palpable that would go along with support from the monarch, the prince, the magistrate, and the state, it was not forthcoming. Contrast this with the situation in Paris from 1664-5 onwards with the Royal Academy of Sciences, where you are paid if you are a member of the Académie Royale. And there is a fixed number of members, and it is an institution of state, and it is designed to aid, support, and work around the power of the king.
Now, Boyle was very much,
Right.
I mean, Boyle was against this.
Sure.
I mean, Boyle believed that his inherited wealth from his family's Irish landholdings were the reason why he could be trusted, because he didn't need to make a profit. He mistrusted medical science in particular, because he saw it as a profit-driven investigation, and that it was his sort of extraordinary, that God had blessed him with wealth, and therefore blessed him to be able to be trusted and pursue his ideas in a zone of disinterest. Pure disinterest.
Because after all, the thought was, if someone is beholden to others, they're untrustworthy in principle.
Well, this is one of the things if we want to talk about contemporary resonances, one of the charges that you hear made against global warming is that there was no funding for any of these people before they came up with global warming. And this is this mistrust that somehow there's profit and a corporate imperative behind certain types of development.
There's another story which perhaps has slightly less contemporary resonance, or maybe it does, which is that there were those within the Anglican Church and out with the Anglican Church who argued loud and long that the King of Great Britain was so by divine right, that he was God's representative on earth, that he was the supreme head of the Church in England. And that great fact was made manifest regularly, at least once a month, in Whitehall, when Charles II touched those who were suffering from scrofula and miraculously cured them. The royal touch, a custom which had been practiced earlier in medieval English kingship and which Charles deliberately resuscitated as part of the cult of monarchy. His saintly and martyred father, for example, was the object of an Anglican cult. There is still a church of Charles, King and Martyr in, of course, Tunbridge Wells.
This is where you could get into the Rosicrucian, the fact that all these guys were Rosicrucians, but we should probably take another question.
No. Yeah.
Okay.
You, please, yes.
There's a creaky analogy between Hobbes and Newton, it seems to be. Risky religious beliefs and a heavyweight rationalism. And, sorry, shall I repeat that? There's a risky religious twist to both Hobbes and Newton, and there's a heavyweight adherence to rationalism.
I agree.
in your play, Hobbes disappears and Newton appears.
Right.
I was wondering if you could say a little more about why you did that and if you thought of this analogy when you did.
Yeah. The dramaturgy there is, I see that effectively what's in common is really that Hobbes and Hooke are who have something in common, and that both of them suffer from the sin of vanity and are undone by, well, Hobbes is undone by dogma, Hooke is undone by the sort of transcendent brilliance, but both are sacrificed. I mean, effectively, they're sacrificed by the Royal Society because their views are considered to be atheistic. So I think what the play is trying to show is that when the Royal Society is done destroying the career or colluding to destroy the career of this presumed atheist, a very short time later they begin to cannibalize themselves and marginalize a figure within their own group who had insufficient religious views. This is, again, his claims he made about fossils and about the backward-reaching past of our Earth and the tilting of the Earth's globe, these things that he saw that were totally unacceptable in his time. But I do think that's what you've said about a creaky analogy between Newton and Hobbes is right. I think they represent radically different figures.
But I think it also goes back to what we were talking about first, which is the notion of the demonstrative. I mean, when Newton goes to war from the 1680s onwards, and then increasingly once he becomes president of this institution in 1703, that's to say just as Hooke is dying, he will claim that his demonstrations are as certain as those of Euclid, by which he means you can't deny his work, for example, in optics, just as you can't deny the second and third book of Euclid's Elements. Now, we're a very long way from Boylean modesty there.
Yeah, I guess both of them don't think that anyone should, that they have to prove anything to anyone. In a way, I mean, Hobbes and Newton do have that in common.
They certainly do.
Is they both find the idea of convincing the unwashed masses an utter waste of time. What do I need with the unwashed masses believing in my philosophy? Can someone please just check me off and name me king of this philosophical pursuit so I can get on with my real work and stop trying to convince people that can never be convinced? Mm-hmm. That was what was different between, if you want to put Newton and Hobbes on one side, that's the contrast between what Boyle was doing, and I think Hooke is really undone by some of his failure to follow the teachings of his patron, Robert Boyle.
Yeah, it's also notorious that Boyle, and indeed Hooke, and certainly Boyle, and this comes through very nicely in the play, is notoriously skeptical about the claims of mathematicians to know the natural world, for a reason which is very striking to us, which is that Boyle's God did not create the world in natural kinds. Boyle's God created the world in individuals. And for Boyle and his personal physician, John Locke, also an FRS, natural kinds, species, are arbitrary collections which are gathered together under names we make. Whereas for others who believe that the world can be known by mathematics in this period, it seems to me they can't be as committed to species skepticism as that. They must believe that there really are kinds and one can really know universals in that sense, so that there's something to Platonism, right? And that, I think, is lurking behind what's in common between Hobbes and Newton and what differentiates them, I think, pretty radically from figures like Boyle and Hooke. Right?
There's time for another question. Yes, okay.
Well, the play is called the Tragedy of Thomas Hobbes, but as you just pointed out, and having seen the play, it seems as if there is more than one tragedy, really, the tragedy of Thomas Hobbes and the tragedy of Hooke. And so I was wondering, I mean, in the end, whose tragedy is it really? And is it really a tragedy? Because, well, I really enjoyed the play, but I really struggled in singling out exactly.
Yeah. I was afraid I was heavily influenced by Henry VI, which anyone that knows Shakespeare's Henry VI knows that Henry VI is not the main character of Henry VI, and that there's a whole circus of characters that populate that play. I wanted to put the full title on there, but that's not economical. And I thought at the time, this tragedy of Thomas Hobbes, we see that a tragedy is motivated by a sin, that a personal tragedy arrives from a fatal flaw, that this sin of vanity, that is the undoing of Hobbes, falls again on Robert Hooke's head 10 years later. But that was where, Shakespeare, you just named the play after the most famous guy in history. Now, in this room, Thomas Hobbes is not famous, but in terms of pop cultural recognition, we thought, it's a producer's type of decision. I'm complicit in it as a producer of my own company, to just simply name the play after whoever's famous, and then once the play begins, you can do whatever you want.
I should say that Hobbes, when he wrote about theatre and poetry, he was a brilliant sociologist of theatre and poetry, and he said, look, the difference between, roughly, comedy, satire, and tragedy, epic, is the difference between the city, over there, and the court, between London and Westminster, between trade and commerce and the street and court life. Tragedies happen at court, and comedies happen in the city. And I think one of the strengths of the play is that it shows a tragedy happening in the street.
There was there was this controversial thing I was all locked and loaded to say, but we didn't get time to say it. I'd rather make myself unpopular now at the very end of it. Well, it's a layman's observation, which is that in looking at this conundrum and in comparing the research I did against, I guess, the layman's notion of a contrast between faith and reason, I came to feel as if actually it's more appropriate to say that empirical science came from the church, and that, in fact, reverence for God, belief in spiritual hierarchies, is what prepared the human race for empirical science. And that Boyle is a figure that sort of shows this to us, that it's not that there aren't sharp breaks and ruptures, there aren't black hats and white hats. This isn't cowboys and Indians, our history. It's organic. And that when you look at Boyle, and Hooke too, you find that the ability to look at in a large image of a flea, or ponder the spring in air, we're prepared for it by a faith that began with God and continues on and evolves into something else now. That was what I wanted. That's something I discovered that is part of the play and part of what I wanted to say about this time.
I think that is very good, because that is, of course, something that has surprising shock value now, where the roles could be said to be completely reversed.
That's right.
Which makes this also very relevant and so very interesting. And maybe it's one of the things about theatre and also about this conversation that we should take away with us, to be able to see different perspectives of each other is really what matters. And it's a very, very difficult thing to do, because once one faction wins, one point of view is dominant, it's so very tempting to forget about any other point of view. It's so much easier life to do that, but it doesn't pay in the long run. It is the other points of view are there, and they can come back with a vengeance.
Yeah. Well, there's a warning from Hooke, that many men think hard about tomorrow, but always end up picturing another yesterday, which is the warning against dogma and thought, and about our ability to break through conditioning to see what might be in the future.
I think this is a perfect note on which to end. And I really think the conversation has been incredibly stimulating. And I think you have demonstrated a number of the really important and relevant themes that are in the play, and in relation to the air pump and the importance of the air pump to the experimentalists, and the role of the air pump, indeed, in the development of science and the development of society and technology and culture, we have to add, is remarkable. Really, one should say it is remarkable that such a play hasn't been written before. So that's really great.
It's like what Huxley says about Darwin, how stupid not to have thought of that.
It was not meant like that. I want to also thank the audience and of course all the helpers who've made this possible this evening. And I want to say to you, those of you who haven't read Simon's book, go and read it.
Simon and Steve.
Simon and Steve. And those who haven't seen the play must go and see it and demand that it will be shown at the West End, as we've seen already. Thank you, Adriano.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you. Okay. Cool. Very cool. Cool, man.